After years studying some of the biggest names in geopolitics, I started noticing a pattern I couldn't ignore. The wars that actually change the world are never just wars. They're economic crises, energy crises, and political crises that quietly converge until they finally tip the global balance. And a growing number of the people who study this for a living believe that process has already begun. I want to take you through exactly how I arrived at that sentence, because it didn't come from one dramatic conversation. It built slowly, across dozens of hours with historians, economists, former diplomats, energy analysts, and people who have spent entire careers inside rooms most of us will never be allowed into. And what struck me, more than any single prediction any of them made, was how consistently they described the same underlying shape, even when they disagreed completely about the details. Almost none of them talk about war the way it gets talked about on the news, as a single event that starts on a specific date for a specific reason. Almost all of them talk about it as the final, visible symptom of pressure that had been quietly building for years, sometimes decades, across several different systems at once, until those systems all failed in the same window of time. I want to spend real time on this, because I don't think a short version does it justice, and I don't think you'll actually feel the weight of it, unless I walk you through the full shape of it, one layer at a time. Let me start with the thing that reframed the entire subject for me, because it's the idea everything else in this video actually sits on top of. When most people think about what causes a major war, they think about a single trigger, an assassination, an invasion, a provocation. And triggers matter, they're real, they're the spark. But almost every serious historian and geopolitical analyst I've spoken to says the same thing about triggers. They're rarely the actual cause. They're the moment a fire that was already smouldering finally catches. The assassination of an archduke in 1914 didn't create the tensions that produced the First World War. Those tensions, a fragile system of overlapping alliances, an arms race between empires, industrial economies competing for resources and markets, and a fading old order struggling to accommodate rising new powers, had been building for a generation. The assassination was simply the specific spark that met all of that accumulated fuel at exactly the wrong moment. And once you start looking at history through that lens, you start seeing the same structure again and again, in conflict after conflict, era after era. The proximate cause gets remembered. The underlying convergence gets forgotten. And I think that's a genuinely dangerous thing to forget, because it means we keep watching for the wrong signal, waiting for a single dramatic spark, when the far more important thing to watch is the slow accumulation of fuel. I want to walk through a couple of historical examples properly, because I think seeing the pattern applied to events you already know changes how you see everything happening now. Take the years leading into the Second World War. The textbook story is simple. An aggressive regime rose to power and invaded its neighbors. That's true, but it's the trigger level story, not the fuel level one. Underneath it sat a global economy still reeling from a depression that had wiped out savings and jobs across multiple continents, a currency and trade system that had fractured into competing protectionist blocs, an energy landscape where access to oil was becoming a matter of national survival rather than convenience, and a set of post-war treaties from the previous conflict that had left entire populations feeling humiliated and economically strangled, with no legitimate path back to influence inside the existing order. Every one of those pressures existed for years before a single tank crossed a border. The war, when it finally came, was in a very real sense the release valve for pressure that had been building the entire time across economics, energy, and a fractured political order, exactly the same three categories the analysts I spoke to keep pointing back to today. Or take the Cold War, which is instructive precisely because it's the case where the worst outcome, direct global war between the major powers, didn't happen, despite decades of exactly the kind of convergence I'm describing. Two competing economic systems, an arms race, competition over energy and resources across the developing world, proxy conflicts fought out in smaller countries rather than directly between the two main powers. The fuel was absolutely present. What several historians pointed out to me is that the difference between that outcome and the outcomes of the two world wars that preceded it wasn't the absence of pressure, it was the deliberate construction of mechanisms to manage that pressure, direct communication channels between rival leaders, arms control agreements, a shared, if uneasy, understanding of the catastrophic cost of the worst-case outcome. The pressure didn't disappear. It got managed, imperfectly, but well enough, for decades, through deliberate human choices rather than luck alone. I think that's one of the most important and most hopeful parts of this entire pattern. And I want to come back to it because it means convergence is not the same thing as destiny. So let me walk you through the specific kinds of fuel that these experts kept coming back to again and again, because I think seeing them laid out clearly is the actual value of everything I learned making this. The first kind of fuel is economic, and specifically, it's debt. Almost every economist and historian I spoke to pointed to the same pattern. Major global conflicts have an uncomfortable habit of arriving in the years after periods of extraordinary borrowing. Once the bill for that borrowing finally comes due, and there isn't an easy way to pay it, this isn't a coincidence, and it isn't really mysterious once it's explained. A country carrying an enormous debt load has fewer good options available to it. Raising taxes enough to cover the debt is politically explosive. Cutting spending enough to cover it is also politically explosive, especially in a democracy where the public can vote a government out for exactly that decision, which leaves a narrower and narrower set of paths. And history shows, again and again, that heavily indebted powers under real fiscal pressure have often found external conflict, or at least external tension, strangely useful. It unifies a divided public against an outside threat. It can justify emergency economic measures that would otherwise be politically impossible. And in the most extreme historical cases, it opens a route to acquiring resources or territory that domestic politics alone could never deliver. I'm not saying every indebted nation marches toward war. Most don't. What I am saying is that several of the historians I spoke to consider the current scale of government debt across major economies, historically, to be in a range that has previously preceded serious instability, and they consider that fact worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as background noise. The second kind of fuel is energy, and this is the one that came up in almost every single conversation, regardless of which expert I was speaking to or which region they specialized in. Access to energy, first coal, then oil, now increasingly a mix of oil, gas, and the rare materials needed for the technologies of the next few decades has been one of the most consistent underlying drivers of major conflict for over a century, even when the public justification for a conflict was framed in entirely different terms. Empires have fought over coal fields. World wars had oil access as a central, if rarely publicly stated, strategic consideration. And what several of the people I spoke to pointed out is that we are currently living through an energy transition unlike any in modern history, a shift away from the resources that built the last century's global order and toward a completely different set of resources: lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, advanced semiconductors concentrated in a different, much smaller set of countries than the old oil order was. That mismatch between where economic and military power currently sits and where the resources for the next era of technology and energy actually are, is exactly the kind of structural tension that has preceded major realignments before. Whoever controls the inputs for the next several decades of technology has enormous leverage over everyone who doesn't, and several analysts described this specific competition over the materials and supply chains for the next energy era as one of the most underappreciated forces currently shaping the decisions being made in capitals around the world. The third kind of fuel is political, and specifically, it's the fragmentation of the old global order. For roughly 70 or 80 years after the Second World War, a huge amount of the world operated inside a relatively stable structure, a dominant power or a small handful of dominant powers, a set of international institutions built to manage disputes between nations, and a general, if imperfect, sense of shared rules everyone was expected to at least pretend to follow. Multiple historians I spoke to pointed to the same pattern across centuries. These periods of relative order don't last forever, and they tend to unravel specifically when a rising power's actual economic and military strength starts to significantly outpace the amount of influence it holds within the existing order, while an established power's influence starts to outpace its actual underlying strength. That mismatch between where power actually sits and where power is formally recognized to sit is one of the oldest and most reliable predictors of major upheaval in recorded history, going back to shifts between rising and declining empires long before the modern nation-state even existed. Several of the people I spoke with believe we are currently living through exactly this kind of transition, a redistribution of real economic and military weight toward a wider set of countries than the post-war order was originally built to accommodate. happening faster than the institutions built to manage that order have been able to adapt. The fourth kind of fuel, and this one came up more than I expected, is demographic. Several analysts pointed to something almost mechanical in how populations shape the risk of instability. Countries with a very large number of young adults, especially young men, relative to the number of stable jobs and leadership opportunities available to them, have historically shown a higher propensity for both internal unrest and external aggression, not because young people are inherently more violent, but because a society with a large, ambitious, underemployed young population and a limited number of legitimate paths to status and opportunity tends to generate exactly the kind of restless pressure that can be channeled, deliberately or not, toward conflict. At the same time, several other major economies are dealing with almost the opposite demographic pressure, aging populations with a shrinking base of younger workers supporting them, which creates a different but equally destabilizing kind of economic strain. Analysts pointed out that having both of these demographic pressures active simultaneously in different major powers at the same historical moment adds yet another layer of structural strain on top of the debt, energy, and order fractures already in motion. I want to be careful here because I think this is exactly the point where a lot of commentary on this subject goes wrong, either by picking a villain and telling a simple story about good countries and bad countries, or by treating this as an inevitable, unstoppable slide toward catastrophe. Almost none of the serious people I spoke to talk this way. What they actually describe is closer to a set of structural pressures that make certain outcomes more likely, not certain, and that makes specific flashpoints more dangerous than they would otherwise be, without predicting exactly where or when or how those pressures resolve. Several distinct regions came up repeatedly as places where these pressures are currently concentrated, most visibly competition over control and influence in Eastern Europe, unresolved tension over the status of Taiwan and the flow of advanced semiconductor manufacturing that runs through it, and long-standing instability across parts of the Middle East, layered on top of energy politics and outside power competition that has shaped that region for over a century. I'm deliberately not telling you which of these is the one to watch, because every single serious person I spoke to gave a different answer to that question, and I think the honest, useful takeaway isn't a single prediction, it's the pattern underneath all of them, multiple simultaneous flashpoints sitting on top of the same underlying convergence of debt, energy competition, demographic strain, and a fraying old order is itself the historically unusual and genuinely concerning part, regardless of which specific flashpoint ends up mattering most. The fifth kind of fuel, and this is the one I think gets the least attention despite possibly being the most novel element of the current moment, is information itself. Every previous era of rising global tension happened inside an information environment that was slow and relatively centralized, even when it was heavily propagandized. Governments controlled newspapers, radio, and later television, and while that control was often used for real harm, it also had one strange side effect. Populations inside a given country tended to share at least a single, coherent, if distorted, version of reality. What several analysts pointed out to me is that the current environment is almost the opposite. Information moves instantly, globally, and in a deeply fragmented way, with different populations, even within the same country, consuming entirely different, algorithmically curated versions of events in real time, each one optimized to hold attention rather than to inform. Several people I spoke with believe this fragmentation makes miscalculation, a government or a population badly misjudging how an adversary will actually respond to a given action, significantly more likely than in past eras, precisely because decision-makers on all sides are increasingly operating with a distorted picture of both their own public's tolerance for conflict and their adversaries' actual intentions and constraints. Historically, some of the most catastrophic escalations happened not because either side wanted the worst outcome, but because each side badly misjudged how far the other was willing to go. A faster, more fragmented, more distorted information environment doesn't create new reasons for conflict on its own, but several people I spoke with believe it substantially raises the odds of that specific kind of catastrophic miscalculation happening once tension is already high. I remember one conversation in particular that pulled all of these threads together for me in a way none of the others had. I was speaking with someone who had spent an entire career inside government, advising on exactly these kinds of questions, someone who has watched several real crises unfold from the inside, and I asked them, fairly directly, whether they thought we were heading toward a major conflict, and they gave me an answer I've thought about constantly since. They said the question itself was slightly the wrong one because it assumes conflict is a single light switch off until suddenly it's on. What they said instead was that we are already living inside the early, less visible stages of exactly the kind of convergence that has preceded every major global realignment in the last several centuries: economic strain, energy competition, demographic pressure, a fraying order, and a public increasingly disoriented about what's actually true. Whether that convergence resolves through a single dramatic war, a series of smaller regional conflicts, a prolonged economic and political Cold War without a single defining battle, or, and they were careful to say this is entirely possible too, through a difficult but ultimately peaceful renegotiation of the global order, they said genuinely isn't knowable in advance, and anyone who tells you with total confidence which of those paths we're on is telling you more about their own politics than about the actual state of the evidence. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it's the most honest thing anyone said to me on this entire topic. This isn't a prophecy of inevitable war. Several of the historians I spoke to were quick to point out that periods of exactly this kind of structural pressure have, in the past, resolved through peaceful, if difficult, renegotiation rather than catastrophe, new institutions built, new balances of power quietly accepted, without a single major war required to force the transition. The years after the Second World War themselves are actually the best example of this. Rather than simply repeating the punishing, humiliating settlement that followed the First War, and that many historians believe directly fed into the Second one, the post-war order was deliberately built around rebuilding former adversaries, creating new institutions for cooperation, and constructing exactly the kind of shared rules that helped prevent the immediate pressures of that era from reigniting into another world war. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't inevitable either. It was a deliberate choice made by specific people in specific rooms who had lived through the alternative and chosen, at real cost, to build something different. What makes the difference between catastrophe and peaceful renegotiation, in almost every historical case these experts pointed to, wasn't luck. It was whether enough of the people involved, on all sides, correctly diagnosed the situation they were actually in early enough and made deliberate, difficult choices to manage the pressure, rather than simply reacting to each individual flashpoint as it rose in isolation, disconnected from the larger pattern. I also want to talk about something several of the economists specifically raised, which is how ordinary people tend to experience this kind of convergence long before it ever reaches the headlines as a geopolitical story. It rarely arrives first as news about troop movements or diplomatic breakdowns. It arrives first as a felt sense in ordinary economic life, prices for everyday goods rising in ways that feel disconnected from any single explainable cause, energy costs swinging unpredictably, a general sense that the ground beneath ordinary financial planning has become less stable than it used to feel. Several analysts describe this as one of the most reliable early indicators available to an ordinary person, long before any of the more dramatic geopolitical signals become visible, precisely because economic strain of this kind is very often the first visible symptom of the same underlying pressures that, left unmanaged, eventually show up as political and military crises further down the line. So let me turn now to what I think is actually useful here, because I don't want to leave you with a sense of looming doom and nothing to do with it. Here's what I've come to believe. An ordinary person, not a diplomat, not a policymaker, just someone living their life and watching the news with a growing sense of unease, might actually do with everything I've just described. First, train yourself to notice the difference between a trigger and a cause in the news you consume every single day. When a specific incident dominates the headlines, ask yourself what longer, slower pressures might already have been building underneath it, rather than treating the incident as a standalone story with its own isolated explanation. This single habit, more than any other, is what separates the analysts who see these shifts coming from the commentators who are constantly surprised by them. Second, pay attention to the boring numbers, not just the dramatic headlines. Government debt levels, energy trade flows, currency stability, demographic trends, none of these make for gripping television, and all of them, according to almost everyone I spoke to, matter enormously more to the actual trajectory of global events than most of what dominates the news cycle. You don't need to become an economist. You just need to develop the habit of occasionally checking the slow-moving, unglamorous indicators instead of only reacting to whichever crisis is loudest this week. Third, actively diversify where you get your information about the world, on purpose, as a discipline. Given how fragmented and algorithmically distorted the information environment has become, deliberately seek out sources with a genuinely different starting perspective from your own, not to become confused or centrist for its own sake, but to build a more accurate picture of how differently the same set of facts is being perceived by people who are not you. Several of the analysts I spoke with consider this kind of deliberate perspective seeking to be one of the most practically useful things any individual can do, precisely because miscalculation between fragmented, distorted worldviews is one of the specific mechanisms they're most worried about. Fourth, think seriously, in an ordinary, practical, unpanicked way, about your own resilience to the kinds of disruption that tend to accompany periods like this: energy price shocks, supply chain instability, currency volatility. This isn't a call to build a bunker or hoard resources out of fear. It's closer to the kind of ordinary preparedness that makes sense before any period of turbulence, financial or otherwise. Some savings that aren't fully exposed to a single currency or a single market. Some awareness of how dependent your daily life is on systems that could be disrupted, and a basic, calm plan for how you'd adapt if prices or availability of key goods shifted suddenly. The people I spoke with who think about this most professionally aren't the ones panicking. They're the ones who've simply built in some slack, quietly, in advance. Fifth, resist the pull toward either extreme response, that this kind of information tends to produce either a paralyzed, doom-scrolling anxiety that convinces you catastrophe is certain and imminent, or a dismissive shrug that convinces you none of this could possibly matter to your actual life. Both of those reactions, in their own way, are a form of not thinking about it clearly. The people who navigate periods of real historical turbulence best, according to every historian I've spoken to, are rarely the most anxious or the most complacent. They're the ones who take the underlying patterns seriously enough to prepare sensibly without letting it consume their daily peace of mind. Sixth, and this is the one I think matters most on a personal level, hold your own political and national narratives a little more loosely than you might be used to. Almost every historian I spoke with pointed out that populations heading into periods of major conflict have, throughout history, been remarkably convinced of their own side's complete righteousness and the other side's complete villainy, right up until the moment the full human cost of that conflict became undeniable. That doesn't mean every side of every dispute is equally justified. They were careful to say that too. It means that certainty itself, especially the comfortable, simple kind that requires no further thought, is worth treating as a signal to look closer rather than a reason to stop looking. Seventh, remember that the periods in history that avoided the worst outcome did so through deliberate, unglamorous, often unpopular choices made by specific people who took the underlying patterns seriously rather than reacting only to the loudest headline of the week. That means the outcome of the current convergence, whichever way it eventually resolves, is not simply something that happens to us. It is, in real and meaningful ways, shaped by how seriously enough people, in enough places, choose to understand it early, rather than waiting for the moment it becomes undeniable, at which point, historically, the range of available good options has always narrowed dramatically. I want to end with something the same former government advisor said to me, right near the end of our conversation, that I haven't been able to shake since. They said every major convergence, like this in history, has eventually resolved one way or another, because they always do, one way or another. The actual question was never whether this particular period of pressure would resolve. It was always what it would cost to get there, and how much of that cost was avoidable if enough people, early enough, took the underlying pattern seriously instead of waiting for the single dramatic headline that finally made it impossible to ignore. By the time that headline arrives, they told me, it's usually far too late to change which path the resolution takes. The actual window for influencing the outcome is always earlier, quieter, and far less dramatic than the moment history eventually remembers. If any of this has landed with you, I don't think the right response is fear, and I don't think it's denial either. I think it's simply attention. Paying closer attention to the slow, unglamorous pressures building underneath the headlines, rather than only reacting to whichever spark finally catches. Because if there's one thing I've taken away from every single conversation that led to this video, it's that the world-changing wars never actually start on the day people think they start. They start years earlier, quietly, in the ledgers, the energy contracts, the demographic charts, and the slow fraying of an old order, long before anyone is calling it a war at all. And the people who understood that early enough throughout history were always the ones best placed to shape what came next, rather than simply being swept along by it.